and welcome to Indo Politics. I'm Mary Regan and I'm joined by our political correspondent, Cónal Thomas, and we are delighted this week to have a political guest in studio and are very happy to welcome the Minister for Justice, Jim O'Callaghan, and thank you, Minister, for coming into our studios here in the Irish Independent House. Cónal and I have a lot to discuss with you, a very broad brief, issues around migration, Ukraine, and of course, Fianna Fáil as it celebrates its centenary. But I just want to start with something that is a pretty live controversy right now, and that is the secret recording of the former Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, at a doorstep in Dublin Central. And he was recorded as saying, "The one thing I do worry about is the Africans." Do you see those racist comments as racist?
Well, I think they were inappropriate, and I'll come back to Bertie's comments in due course. But I also think it's important that we're able to have a discussion about immigration. And on a lot of occasions when we're discussing immigration, it's in the context of something that gets heightened publicity, such as the comments of Bertie Ahern, or indeed a one-off attack, say, by a migrant in our community. So it's important that we're able to discuss it outside of individual examples of where people have found themselves engaged in something that's viewed as inappropriate. I think it probably was inappropriate of him because he was identifying that some people are less favourable than others because of where they emanate from in terms of the countries they emanate from. And so in that respect, I think it was inadvisable, inappropriate. But
not racist.
I don't think it's racist. I don't think Bertie Ahern is a racist person. I've known him for a long time. In terms of the issues that we've had on this island, in terms of trying to stop sectarianism between Catholic and Protestant, particularly in Northern Ireland. I don't think there's anyone on the island who has done as much to build trust and links with the Protestant Unionist community in Northern Ireland as Bertie has. I think the comments were inappropriate, but I don't believe Bertie Ahern is a racist.
Should he apologise?
Well, again, I'm not in the business of directing people what they should or shouldn't do. Just at the outset as well, I suppose it is a reflection of modern society that people are now secretly recording people when they're having conversations with them. That's something that I must say I don't like the sound of that. I think if I'm having a conversation with somebody that it isn't recorded, unless they're going to tell me it's going to be recorded. But listen, it has attracted a lot of attention. I think it was inappropriate of him to identify certain nationalities or people from a certain continent, because when we're talking about migration and immigration, it's important we have a discussion about it. I think the issue is that it should be discussed at a principle basis rather than saying, well, people from this country are better than people from that country.
But do his comments risk legitimising what might be considered more, far-right, extreme views on migration that aren't helpful to that discussion that you talk about?
Well, listen, I've been on the doorsteps in Dublin Central for John Stevens and in Galway West for Killian Keane, and people are talking to me about migration, and maybe it's because I'm the Minister for Migration, they have the opportunity. So people are discussing it, and it is important that centre ground politicians and journalists such as yourselves are able to discuss it openly and to be able to discuss it in an orderly and mature fashion. And it's a big issue that needs to be discussed. And sometimes I'm concerned that the only time we discuss it is in the context of, an event that has occurred, whether or not it's Bertie Ahern's comments, whether it's not, sometimes there's an attack by a person who's a migrant and that generates a big discussion about it. We need to be able to discuss it maturely and objectively and look to see to what extent is immigration good for Ireland. My own view is it has been very good for Ireland. Historically, people left this country. Now people are coming in, and I suppose we're entitled to have a mature discussion about to what extent do we want to control it. And what I've sought to do as Minister is to have a system which is firm but fair.
And he did say that he had concerns about the next generation of Muslims living in this country and that he discussed those concerns with you. So what kind of conversations have you had with Bertie Ahern, and do you share those concerns?
Well, listen, it's not just Bertie Ahern. Can I tell you, like 3 weeks ago, I got a report from the Independent Examiner of Security Legislation, Mr. Justice George Birmingham. It's a report that got a lot of coverage in the Irish Independent and other newspapers. And one of the issues he identified in his report was the threat from Islamic terrorism. Now, I know the overwhelming majority of Muslim people in Ireland are law-abiding people and very, very welcomed into the country. But I can't ignore the fact, I suppose, what's been said by the Independent Examiner. It has been an issue in other countries. And I don't think we can just not talk about matters because they may be perceived as being, they could give succour to people on the far right. If we don't talk about issues like this, inevitably the far right are going to have the whole territory to themselves.
Are you saying in some ways that people are sort of afraid to talk about this?
I think
in case they might be branded?
I think sometimes there is a concern about raising issues to do with immigration in an Irish context, because obviously there are some people in the country who are vehemently opposed to immigration. But I would have thought the majority of people have a sensible centre ground approach which recognises the very valuable contribution that immigration has had to Ireland. Like, the reason people are coming to this country is it's because it's so economically successful. Like, if we want to have no immigration here, we should try and go back to what we were like before, say in the 1950s or even before we got our independence. So there's positives to immigration. I think we need to be able to talk about it though, and we shouldn't shy away from it. And I think discussions should be based on data, really, as opposed to anecdote.
Minister, I suppose we've had two political figures in the last week. We've had former Taoiseach and Gerry Hutch, a candidate in Dublin Central, both raise immigration in that area. It is obviously a pronounced problem in Dublin Central, in that area. We have an over-concentration, and we've seen these controversy around IPAS centres and stuff. So does it rankle, do you think, with the Irish public, that €1 billion spend on IPAS centres a year, as you lead into what you're designing now, which is effectively a new migration strategy that will dictate our policy for the next 10 years?
Well, it's just in terms of to distinguish what Gerry Hutch said, what Bertie Ahern said. Like, Bertie Ahern, I know people may criticise, he thought he was having a private conversation. He wasn't putting his words out into the public domain. Gerry Hutch obviously said it at a public meeting. So that was a very deliberate statement by him. In terms of asylum, asylum is one part of the immigration issue in Ireland. And although it's only a small part, it is the most politically contentious, as you've indicated. And I suppose the reason it's politically contentious is that other types of migration involve people coming in for work permits who are unable to work here and are able to, I suppose, pay their own way, being blunt. When it comes to asylum, we have an obligation under the Receptions Conditions Directive to provide accommodation. And a part of the having a mature discussion is it is unquestionably the case that the establishment of a lot of IPAS centres has had an impact on local communities' views about immigration. So I've sought to diffuse that. You mentioned Dublin 1, Cónal. I haven't, since I've become minister, opened any more IPAS centres in Dublin 1 because I believed that there was an over-concentration of them in Dublin.
And your department recently confirmed, in fact, though, to the PAC that the state is being sued by private commercial providers. I believe in 5 cases, 2 of them settled. And as we move towards, say, unwinding the Ukrainian sports, are you anticipating more cases, more legal cases against the state from commercial operators?
Well, I'm not as the direct answer, but I suppose it's a reflection of the policy that I've implemented, and there were reasons for those contracts not going ahead, and they're before the court, so I don't want to get into too much detail of it. But I do have an obligation as minister to reduce the amount of money that we're spending, and I'm having some success. For the first time in years, our spend on IPAS this year has gone down from what it was last year. And in terms of Ukrainian accommodation, the state spent 1.2 billion in 2024. This year we'll be spending 600 million. So I'm reducing the cost, because that spiralling cost that was going up was unsustainable.
Explain to me just for a minute before we get on to the Ukrainians, though, because you're designing the migration strategy, obviously, to come into effect alongside or roughly around the same time, I suppose, the EU-wide asylum pact, which is kind of an overhaul, let's face it. Now, some things that have been mooted within that pact are quite controversial. So can you just explain to our listeners around what you might call these proposed detention centres to hold people who might be here legally? Are we going to see them, and where are they going to be?
Well, First of all, in terms of the national migration strategy, that's a strategy that I'm putting in place. That won't come out till later on in the year. In terms of the pact itself, the pact will commence on the 12th of June. I brought through the Oireachtas, the most significant reform of our asylum laws that was signed by the President recently. And there are provisions within it which I think are important and necessary. But like in all of these issues, one of the things, what you have to do is to weigh up. On the one hand, you have the interests of the asylum applicant coming in, but on the other hand, have to weigh up the interests of the state and the interests of the state. And in terms of the issue about detention, there are limited provisions within the legislation that allow for detention. But like one of the obligations, if somebody comes in and claims asylum, what I've required under the legislation is that they have to provide biometric data and they have to go to a screening centre. And if they don't do that, there's a mechanism there for them to be detained for the purpose of identifying who they are.
Will the state need additional stock to detain them, though?
Well, I hope and believe that the overwhelming majority of people who come here claiming asylum will comply with the law. Like, we're entitled to set down certain requirements on people who come here. If you come to Ireland, you claim asylum, you have to give your biometric data and you have to go to a screening centre. There's no exception to that. And if you don't do that, you'll be detained.
You said that the cost of IPAS was unsustainable and that you said about diffusing the situation. To that extent, do you think Ireland got its migration policy wrong for a long time?
Well, listen, all I look at is what's there at present. I'm not going to comment on the situation that predecessors found themselves in. And obviously, if you look around Europe, particularly at present, like there's been migration's a huge issue in the 21st century. When the history of the 21st century is going to be written, migration's going to be a hugely significant story. And you can look to see what happened in 2015, 2016 in Germany. And obviously, Ireland had low numbers of people coming claiming asylum prior to COVID. It was around 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 a year. But then after COVID, it took off significantly. In 2024, it was 18,500 people came in. Last year, I got it down to 13,000. And like, I don't make any apologies about saying it. I want to reduce the number of people coming to Ireland claiming asylum. And the reason I want to do that is because of data. Because the data tells me, for instance, this year, 5,500 people have had their asylum applications adjudicated. 83% have been rejected. And even when you take into account appeals, the appeal rate allows around 30%. So the very, very significant majority of people coming to Ireland claiming asylum are not entitled to asylum. They're entitled to claim asylum, but ultimately we can see that they don't get asylum. And that's information that I'm entitled to use for the purpose of developing policy.
And is that a humane approach, do you think, given the scale of conflict and what people are fleeing around the world?
Yeah, but what you have to take into account, the people who have their applications rejected, they're not fleeing conflict. They're not fleeing war. They're here, and it's probably something we would do as well. They're here because there are economic opportunities for them in Ireland. I would much prefer, and I think would make the whole system operate more effectively, if people who wanted to come to Ireland for economic reasons used the economic avenues that are available to come here, as opposed to misusing the asylum system.
OK, and in June 2022, the Taoiseach, in an address to the European Parliament, said Ireland was honoured that more than 34,000 Ukrainians sought shelter in this country. And he said Ireland would stand with Ukraine, not just during the war, but in the months and years ahead, because he said they are our fellow Europeans. But now you want to pay Ukrainians to leave.
That's not fully accurate, but certainly the response of Ireland to the war in Ukraine was extremely generous. And what the Taoiseach said was absolutely correct. Approximately 113,000 people from Ukraine came to Ireland, applied for and were granted temporary protection. There's around 84,000 left at present. Ireland was more generous than any other European country when it came to accommodation. The obligation under the Temporary Protection Directive was that you have to provide access to accommodation. We went further and we provided accommodation to people. And I suppose what we're doing now is, and a lot of the Ukrainians, have moved out of state accommodation and they've got their own accommodation, and the accommodation recognition payment has helped with that. But at present, there's around 16,500 people who are still in state accommodation, which is provided free. Many of them are working. Myself and Colin Brophy have worked through this, and we think it is more appropriate appropriate that we move away from state-provided accommodation, and people who are working should make a contribution. But that decision is going to Cabinet on proposals going to Cabinet on Tuesday week, and a decision will be made by.
And do you think it's appropriate to send Ukrainians home to a situation that can be uncertain, can be dangerous, where people are living their lives based around when alarms are going off, when there are strikes, when there are power outages, and just yesterday 6 killed by Russia in Ukraine?
I was in the Dáil this morning answering questions on this very issue, temporary protection, and I emphasised, and I think it's important we remember, the reason for temporary protection is because of Russia's illegal and unlawful invasion. And that needs to stop. So a lot of measures were put in place. But when I'm in Europe, there are discussions about temporary protection. Temporary protection is never envisaged to last forever. The reason it's called temporary protection is because it is temporary. It's extended until March 2027. I've also been addressed, as of other EU ministers, by the Ukrainian Minister for Home Affairs. They want people to go back home. And the reason they want people to go back home is their population has been diminished. They want to rebuild their country. I'm fully aware, by the way, that there'll be people in Ireland from Ukraine who want to stay. There'll be many who want to go back home. If they needed assistance to go back home, I would have thought it's reasonable to help them.
Just on that assistance, Minister, can you clarify a little bit what those payments might look like? I mean, are they sums to set people up back home, or just incentivise them back to Ukraine out of Ireland?
First of all, a decision hasn't been made on that as of yet. But if you look at the international protection system, we do have a system for voluntary returns. But in many instances, when it comes to Ukrainians, a lot of them will want to go back home. And those who want to go back home and can afford it will just do that. But if there's issues in terms of people who have difficulty in terms of paying for their flight back or issues like that, we might make a contribution in that respect.
Right. Are you in favour of it?
I am in favour of providing assistance to people who want to return to Ukraine. We look at it here. Ukrainians have made a very good contribution here. But from the other side of it, from the Ukrainian side, their population has been very significantly affected by it. They want their people back to rebuild their country. And I suppose what everyone in Europe wants to see is the war ended, Ukraine to go back to peace, and people to be able to return to their homeland.
Do you have a figure in mind either for how much of a contribution or how many people you might want to see return on this programme?
I haven't, but from the voluntary return scheme and international protection that there are payments available to assist people to go out. I would have thought in the context of international protection, it is more difficult to persuade people to go back, because a lot of the people who came through international protection and who have been told they can't stay are people who came here for economic reasons, and there's a desire to stay here. People did leave Ukraine because of the war. That's clearly the case. And I think probably if the war ends and things settle down, that then it'll be easier for people to repatriate themselves back to Ukraine.
Will there be anything to prevent someone who takes such a payment, returns to Ukraine, from coming back to Ireland a few weeks or a few months later?
There will be, of course. And this system operates in terms of the international protection system. People, if they are put out of the country, they're not allowed to return. And also in terms of any payments. And now I'm talking about small payments here. Payments will be made only on their arrival back in the country.
Would they not be entitled to refugee status under European...
We're not going to have a situation where somebody has come to Ireland, has benefited from temporary protection. Then we pay the money to repatriate them back to the Ukraine. And then they come back to Ireland to claim international protection. That's not feasible. That's not going to happen. What we're going to try and deal with is, as I say, we've 84,000 people here. Some of them will want to go back home. A good few have gone back home. Some of them won't have the resources to go back home. I think we should be in a position to help them. And then there's a third group. Some will want to stay, and we're just going to have to work through that.
You mentioned a decision, and it's my understanding that this was due to go to Cabinet this week, but was pulled. What happened? Were there tensions at Cabinet? Is the Taoiseach harbour concerns around this plan?
There was no tension. We had a very good subcommittee meeting at the Cabinet a couple of weeks ago. Myself and Colin Brophy are absolutely singing off the same hymn sheet on this issue. We're going to bring it to Cabinet. Actually, there's a very mundane reason as to why it's not gone this week and it's going next week, but I won't go into it.
Is the Taoiseach singing off the same hymn?
Yes, very much
given
so.
The comments that he made previously.
Listen, 2020, I was looking today because I was answering questions. Back in 2022, I was looking at Mary Lou welcoming Ukrainians, welcoming the use of modular homes. Obviously, 2022, no one envisaged this was going to go on for 4 years, okay? So, like, even in Europe now, there's a recognition that something needs to be done in terms of temporary protection. Obviously, we're putting in place and will be putting in place proposals for how we as a country respond to Ukrainian people here. Similarly, at an EU level, that we're working on what's going to happen to temporary protection in March 2027. And like just talking to people at the EU level, like I think if it's extended, it could be extended on terms.
And just on the issue of migration and racial tensions in this city, not far from where we are now, there were riots in Dublin. A task force was set up in the wake of that, and it recommended an extra 1,000 Gardaí. Do you know how many more Gardaí have been recruited since then? Because the Dáil heard yesterday that it was just 40 have been hired in Dublin since then.
Well, sorry, Gardaí recruited obviously there are significant numbers of Gardaí who have been recruited since then. And
how many extra Gardaí in Dublin since the 1,000 was recommended?
In terms of, we haven't got there. The numbers are low in terms of the extra number of Gardaí in Dublin. But what has changed...
As low as 40?
Yeah, could be as low as 40. But what has changed is that the Commissioner is now implementing government policy of high visibility policing. So we now have 14,661 sworn members of An Garda Síochána. They're getting out and effecting high visibility policing. You see it in Dublin, see it in O'Connell Street. People mention it to me. It's happening in Cork, it's happening in Limerick. We're going to roll it out in Galway, and it'll happen in rural areas as well. So we're using the resources more effectively because people want to see Gardaí on the streets. But I suppose I have to take into account, I was answering a question on this in the Dáil today, like I can't just say to the Commissioner, give every new Guard to Dublin. I've got to be fair about it. And around 758 new Gardaí have gone to the DMO, I think, central region since the report came out. But obviously others have moved on.
Do you think the streets of Dublin are safer now than they were when you became Minister?
Yeah, I do actually, and I'm not trying to present myself as I do think Dublin has got safer because there's a higher visibility of Gardaí on the streets, and that's a policy that this government asked the Commissioner to implement and is being implemented. Like if you look around the world in terms of crime rates, Dublin and Ireland are pretty low on the crime rate statistics. I had a group of American attorneys general over recently, and when I told them that the number of homicides last year was around the region of 50 in Ireland, they thought I had made a mistake. And when I told them that there were no gun-related killings last year, they didn't believe me. Now, that happens because of the excellent work of An Garda Síochána.
There have been well-aired recruitment and retention issues in the Gardaí for many years now, Minister. I mean, the Social Democrats, in fact, went as far to say last week that you have opted instead for platitudes and soundbites on the issue. So what's your response to that, right?
Well, it's hard.
Firstly, and what is the figure that you want to see in this year's budget in terms of extra Gardaí?
Well, in terms of sound bites, I deal with statistics. I deal with high visibility policing. At present, as I said to Mary, we have 14,661 sworn members. The highest number we ever had in the force was, I think, 14,700. So by the end of this year, we will have the highest number of sworn Gardaí in the history of the state, as we should, because our population's increasing. But on top of that, like we've 3,664 staff members who are doing jobs that previously were done by the Gardaí. I got in the budget last year for An Garda Síochána, they have a separate vote. I got 2.25 billion euro for An Garda Síochána. So they have the resources. I launched a new recruitment campaign.
How much do you want to see for next year?
I want to see as many Gardaí recruited as possible. And recruitment is going really well now, though, Cónal, because like I was down in Templemore 2 weeks ago, 193 new Gardaí passed out, 200 went in. So we're consistently seeing now 200 coming in, 200 coming out. And as well as that, you spoke about retention. There is not a retention crisis in An Garda Síochána. Like retention crises are when people are resigning from a job. Resignations from An Garda Síochána are less than 1%, which is unprecedented when you compare, say, the PSNI or forces in the UK.
Can I just ask, there's two policy areas I suppose you've made quite a big play of in relation to An Garda Síochána. You recently said, and through a PQ actually, the taser guns provided the Gardaí have yet to be discharged 3 months into the pilot project. Does that show they are not needed, or will this be expanded to other areas beyond Dublin? Do we need it at all?
Yeah, I think we do need it. And, it's commendable that they haven't been used that frequently. But I am aware...
Then why do we need them?
Because Gardaí are being attacked. We saw in August last year a very serious attack on a guard in Capel Street. Very serious attack on a guard. And, you know, I'm not prepared to allow a situation to develop where an attack like that can happen and a guard is dependent upon his pepper spray or his baton. So in certain instances, I think it is appropriate that tasers are available to An Garda Síochána. My top priority is to ensure that they are protected in the work that they are doing. And the Gardaí they have a really outstanding international record, actually, in terms of community policing, because Gardaí police the community through the consent, through discussion. The biggest issue I have as a politician when I go into Dáil is every TD wants me to send more Gardaí to their community, which is a really good sign in a way. It shows how trusted the Gardaí are. So that's a very special relationship. It's an unarmed police force, but I believe that tasers are required, and it's been done on a pilot basis, as you know now.
And obviously it'll be a disappointment to you, though, as well, that electronic monitoring of prisoners has effectively stalled because the tender process hasn't worked. You made a big play of that. You previously said the system we rolled out by the end of last year, at the very latest, said it was embarrassing that it hadn't happened sooner.
I know, in fairness to me, and I know
Where's
that's not something. I'll tell you exactly where it is. That legislation was introduced nearly 20 years ago and nothing happened on it, even though the legislation providing for the electronic monitoring of prisoners was on our statute book. I have insisted that the tender be run. The tender has now been run. Bids have come in. I'm committed to getting electronic monitoring up and running.
When?
Listen, it's going in terms of the time span. I've got tenders in. We're going to make a decision in respect of it. This is something that happens in the PSNI. It happens in the UK. It happens elsewhere. And it's also not just about, it's not really a punitive measure. It's about as well freeing up prison spaces to ensure that we can have people monitored without the necessity of incarcerating them. So I won't give you a figure or date in terms of when it'll be done, but it'll certainly, my assessment will be done within the next 12 months. And I want it to happen this year.
We move on a little bit to the wider party matters, and Fianna Fáil is obviously marking its centenary this weekend. Give us your assessment, Minister, where Fianna Fáil's at. It is a much diminished force from where it was 100 years ago.
Well, I don't know about that. 100 years ago, it was just embryonic. Nobody thought it was going to get off the ground. It has been the most successful political party in Ireland. It has been one of the most successful political party in the world, if you look at it over the past 100 years. It has been centrally involved in leading this country to the position it occupies today. I know we don't hear this, and people are not suggesting people are required to say this, but if you look at post-colonial independent countries around the world, there is no more successful example of one than Ireland. No more successful example. And that's why people look at us and say, God, Irish independence has worked out extremely well. Back in 1916, 1922, people thought the idea of Ireland going on their own was a crazy idea, that we wouldn't survive. You saw the discussion in Scotland when they were discussing Scottish independence. It has been a real success, and that's notwithstanding the very significant challenges and indeed failings of government that have happened during the 100 years. But if we look at what Fianna Fáil did in terms of the constitution, in 1937, while the rest of Europe was gone crazy on fascism, Eamon de Valera brought in a constitution that has guaranteed fundamental rights and that has put in place a constitutional architecture still alive today. He kept us out of the Second World War. Very sensible decision based on the self-interest of the people of Ireland. Fianna Fáil brought us into the European Economic Community in 1973, and the Good Friday Agreement, we spoke about Bertie Ahern earlier on. Good Friday Agreement ended violence on this island. So Fianna Fáil was involved in all of them, and I'm extremely proud of the record that Fianna Fáil has in terms of that. Obviously, Fianna Fáil is not as strong now as it was, say, in 2007, 2006, the global financial crisis had a significant impact on political parties around the world, particularly those that were in power at the time. But remember the narrative in 2011 when Micheál Martin took over. Fianna Fáil's finished. You're never getting back. He's never going to be Taoiseach. We're now the largest party in the Oireachtas. We're the largest party in local government, and we have, I think, the equivalent number of the largest
would have said to me
in the European Parliament.
John Downing is writing in this weekend's Irish Independent, and he says, how did it take 100 years for Fianna Fáil to become this small? Does the party have any future beyond its current limitation or size, or is it destined to be a sort of medium-sized party?
Sometimes, with the greatest of respect to journalists, sometimes politicians are entitled to stand up for themselves. Like Fianna Fáil has been a remarkably successful political party. And look, take into account the global financial crisis and the fact that we are now the largest party in the Oireachtas. So we're an extremely resilient party. We've done a huge amount in this country in terms of making this country the successful post-colonial independent country that it is. I'm reading Sean Lemass's book at present, written by Rona McGreevy. Like, people forget what this country was like in, say, the 30s or the 40s, or when we got our independence.
But that's all in the past, and it might be meaningless to some younger voters. So if there was someone who's just turning 18, they haven't voted yet, they will, over the next couple of years, vote for the first time. What would you say to them that Fianna Fáil can do for them or stand for?
There's a real benefit in Fianna Fáil because we're a centre ground national party. We seek to represent the interests of all sections of Irish society. We don't concentrate on a particular grouping within Irish society. Look at our record. Look at the fact that we're the party that actively wants to seek Irish reunification. We're the party that has redistributed wealth very significantly within the country. We have built up the economy to where it is today. Like, when I go to other countries, and sorry, I'm not trying to diminish the challenges here, but when you look at the surplus that we're producing, the economic success that we have in Ireland, the fact that so many multinationals are coming in here, this was Sean Lemass's proposal. He decided in the 1950s, we need to change course. We need to attract multinationals into this country. We need to broaden out investment. It's a remarkable success.
But I suppose, do you believe under Micheál Martin, though, that the party has somewhat drifted from its Republican ethos? I mean, you are a minister who has previously left the door open for going into government with Sinn Féin, something your party leaders emphatically ruled out. You're also far more considered on the issue of a Unite Ireland as Leo Varadkar was. So there's an inner shinner there, isn't there?
Can I just say one thing I'm not going to do when we're discussing Fianna Fáil is discuss Fianna Fáil by reference to other political parties. You can ask politicians from other political parties in here, and I've no doubt they'll be able to speak for their party. As I said earlier, Micheál Martin's done an excellent job. In terms of the challenges that Fianna Fáil leaders have faced, probably he had the biggest challenge when you look at what he took over in 2011 than any of the other previous leaders. So like, his record speaks for itself in respect of it. Fianna Fáil is committed to Irish reunification. It's an issue upon which we've played a central role. If you look at the Good Friday Agreement, if you look at the Shared Island Initiative, if you look at what Sean Lemass said in the book about the fact that the way we will get reunification is by engaging with our brethren in Northern Ireland on issues like electricity supply, in terms of the economy, cross-border discussion. Get to know them, get to engage them. And I was doing that. One of the products of Fianna Fáil and the Good Friday Agreement was evident to me last Friday when I was up in Armagh at the North-South Ministerial Council. And Irish ministers sitting down with the executive from Northern Ireland. So like, there's a lot of successes in this country. And I know and I respect the fact that it's the function of, journalists to probe the failings and the difficulties. But also it is, it's a prerogative of mine as a member of Fianna Fáil to point out the successes.
It's also the function of a younger person who can't buy a house and never sees a future for themselves in this country, owning their own property.
I'm fully
question their politicians.
Absolutely, I fully appreciate that, and it's the biggest challenge that we face. Housing, but we are making progress in respect of it. Like, part of the reason why housing is so expensive is because Ireland has become such a successful economy. We need to increase and really expedite supply. James Brown is doing a very good job in respect of that, and I think there is a great opportunity for young people to stay in Ireland and to see a great future for themselves in Ireland. It is a fantastic country in which to live. There's a wonderful quality of life. We spoke about crime rates. Obviously, there's always going to be crime in countries. Crime rates in Ireland are particularly low. I want to see them get lower. But we have a good quality of life here, and I think most people recognise that.
Your ministerial colleague, Dara Cleary, said this week that loads of people are suggesting him as the future leader of Fianna Fáil. Are loads of people suggesting you?
No, I think my mother did maybe a couple of years ago, but aside from that, no, I don't think so.
So not as many as Dara Cleary?
I don't know, I don't think so.
Is it something that you see in your immediate or medium-term future?
Well, of course, I can't predict the future, but at some stage, if I'm healthy and still a member of Dáil Éireann and there's a vacancy for the position of leader of Fianna Fáil, it's something I'd be interested in going for.
So what do you say to your mother then when she suggests you as a leader?
Oh, I don't really answer.
Okay, but do you think now there is a sort of timeline in the party's mind as to when Micheál Martin will be replaced as leader?
Listen, I'm also there's obviously, you both do your job extremely well professionally, and your objective is to try and get a narrative out of me that may create some conflict or tension, and I perfectly respect you doing that. But I suppose from my point of view, I don't want to be seen to be somebody who's doing a Wes streeting of it, since I've used that point today. So there's no vacancy at present. Micheál Martin, as I said, is doing a very good job. He's been leader for a period of time. A vacancy will arise at some stage in the future. At that stage, I'll come back to you and I'll talk to both of you about that. And
some people in your party have said, there's been mutterings about the leadership for a year now, but you haven't sort of gone for it, and that perhaps you're just sort of standing back, waiting for it to land on your lap instead of perhaps having the ambition to fight for it.
Listen, my ambition in politics was to be Minister for Justice, and it is a real privilege to do that job. And I think I'm doing a good job and I'm effective in that job. And there's lots of things I want to do in it, and I enjoy every day of it. And listen, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we'll deal with other issues when they arise.
Do you accept, though, Minister, that, as the sort of, successor, as it were, in waiting, and we would have seen this in our recent poll figures, we should just touch a little bit on the response to the fuel protests, I think, because that did appear to damage you politically. Yeah. Do you accept that you made a mistake during that period when the army was due to be called in and did not show up?
Well, listen, short answer is I don't, but I fully appreciate the tensions and pressures people are under as a result of increasing fuel costs. It's just having a very serious impact in terms of the cost of living for people. But there's certain things that we can and can't control. And obviously, Operation Epic Fury is something that we can't control. And we have, however, introduced measures that have reduced the pressures on people. In terms of your specific question, it is the case that the Guards did request the army to come in. The army came in and assisted in Garda Síochána. Had I not announced that, the big question from the media would have been, who brought the army? Why weren't we told about this?
The question afterwards was that people were saying, where is the army?
I know, but I don't control operationally how the Gardaí or the Defence Forces do their work. I just want to say as well, I think the Gardaí did a very good job in terms of protest. I fully respect the right of people to protest, and I understand the reason people were protesting. But what I couldn't do is allow blockades of refineries and our ports to continue. Because if it was the case that there was no fuel in the petrol stations, if there was no bread on the stands in the supermarkets, people would legitimately be saying to me, what are you doing? You're supposed to be the Minister for Justice. Why aren't the Guards clearing this so as we can get our products in? So, had I not done anything about it, I think the criticism legitimately would have been much more. I would have failed in my duty as Minister for Justice. It's not my job as Minister for Justice to be thinking about how is this going to reflect favourably on me or not. But I just have to say, since the Gardaí had requested the assistance of the army, I thought it was the right, fair thing and the transparent thing to say it.
So you have no regrets about saying that then, by the sounds of things?
I don't. I don't have any regrets about it because it was true. If it's the case to be now that journalists want me not to reveal what's actually happening, that would be surprising. But had I not said anything about it, and then when the army trucks were seen moving in, inevitably people could have said, who ordered the army? Why weren't we told this? When was this decision made? So, there were discussions about it. It was a difficult time. I'll admit that to you. It was certainly a difficult time. But as Minister for Justice, I was the one politically responsible for the Gardaí. Gardaí did an excellent job. Commissioner did an outstanding job. And what was really outstanding was that the blockades were ended without any injuries to the Gardaí or to the public.
But a lot of people, including in your own party, some people would say that those comments added fuel to the flames and actually made the protesters more angry. And more disconnected, as they saw it, from the government.
That wasn't my intention. That wasn't my intention. I'm just conscious of the counterfactual had I not announced it, because it was true. Like, maybe what I'm being told is that you shouldn't have said that. You should have kept it quiet and then just let the army come in as they did when they did come in. But listen, I've no problem acknowledging to you, it was a very difficult time. But as Minister for Justice, the buck stops with me in terms of the performance of the Gardaí and ending the blockades. Like, you can't allow people to blockade refineries. You can't allow people to blockade ports. You just can't allow that. Okay. And if it makes me the Minister for Law and Order, well, I'm happy to be seen as the Minister for Law and Order. That's more important than being popular.
Just there's your own trajectory in your own career. I mean, you may be Taoiseach one day, and it was your sister Miriam O'Callaghan who actually told the Irish Times, why should my career be impacted by a man? Congrats to him on having his career, but my career is my career. The day of patriarchy is dead. Can I ask, did you discuss those comments with your sister?
It's good. I just say one thing to you. I have no problem you asking me any questions, but I'm not here to answer for any of my wonderful sisters. They're all women well able to speak for themselves. I don't speak for them. I've been very lucky to have such a wonderful family, but I'm not speaking for any of my wonderful sisters.
And just on that, I mean, I would make the point that I know who Micheál Martin is, I know who Simon Harris is, certainly, and I know who Mary Lou McDonald is. Who is Jim O'Callaghan?
Well, I don't think it's absolutely necessary, to be honest with you, that you have an intimate understanding who I am. And one thing that not irritates me, but I suppose concerns me about politics, it's become very folksy and sort of personal. People want to know personal details about their politicians. I just do my job. I'm a member of Dáil Éireann. It took a long time to get elected. It's a great privilege to be there. I represent my constituents as best I can. And in terms of fulfilling the job of Minister for Justice, I get up every morning excited about the job I have to do, and I enjoy it. Who am I? I'm a hard-working Fianna Fáil TD who has the privilege of being Minister for Justice.
But not just on the personality side, on the policy side. You mentioned Lemass being associated with, building this country's economic policy. Bertie Ahern associated with the boom, potentially the bust after that. What would you like to be your greatest association as a policy, as a politician?
Well, I think that the partition of this island after the famine was the worst thing that happened to the people of the island. I think it was a sectarian solution to a political problem. I think when you look at the reasons for partition back in 21, 22, there were understandable reasons why the northeast of the island wanted to get out. There was fear of an oppressive Catholic Church. There was fear that the southern economy was so weak that it would stagnate the vibrant northern economy. Both those reasons are now gone. And I think we need to recognise that, the world is changing quickly. In the UK, our history is enormously impacted by what happens in the UK. It's always been the case. And it's not unusual. Very large, heavily populated island beside a smaller island, which colonised us. So our history is enormously affected by them. Similarly, now we're on a trajectory where it could be, I don't know whether it'll happen, that reform will get into government in the UK. We've seen nationalist parties all over the UK. There's a nationalist party leading in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, in Wales. And let's be straight about it, Reform is a nationalist English nationalist party. So we need to be prepared for the fact that the issue of Irish unification may come upon us quicker than we expect. And certainly that's something I would like to play a role in. I think Irishness is very, it's varied. Like I know sometimes Northern Unionists think that, Irish culture is exclusively Kneecap or that type of stuff. Kneecap are a very talented group, good film. But it's a much more, it's a much broader texture of Irishness that exists here now. And I just think it's important that we engage with people in Northern Ireland, as this is something that could happen sooner rather than later.
And is that reunification question something that you think Fianna Fáil needs to maybe reclaim or take ownership of?
I think we have it. I think we've always had it. I think Micheál has done, I think Micheál's done an excellent job in terms of the shared island initiative. And if you look at the history, the only party who's going to be able to do this is, I believe, Fianna Fáil. and I don't want to talk about other parties, but because of what happened in Northern Ireland for 30, 35 years, that creates a lot of baggage and it leaves a long, long legacy. Fianna Fáil, Bertie Ahern, has an excellent legacy in Northern Ireland, as does Micheál Martin. And I think we underestimate the ability of Fianna Fáil to be able to engage with unionist politicians and Republican nationalist politicians in Northern Ireland. I think we underestimate our abilities and strength in that area.
So after months of upheaval in the party and backbiting in parliamentary party meetings and no heave and no heave again, do you think Fianna Fáil is a united party going into tomorrow?
Oh yeah, like, there's always friction like within Fianna Fáil. Like, you know, I'd say Lamass for years was waiting, would De Valera ever move on? You know, like he was there a very, very long time.
That's something you can relate to?
No, it isn't, because in fairness to Micheál Martin, he's nowhere near the length of time that Eamon De Valera served as leader. But there's always been tension in Fianna Fáil, particularly in respect to the issue of leadership. But, you know, tension sometimes is beneficial in politics. Keeps you awake, keeps you alive, keeps you on your toes, and, you know, gets people excited about it. And I think Fianna Fáil is an exciting party. It's a party that young people should consider, and it is something that I think that we have a great record in the past, and I believe we'll have an even better record in the future.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Minister, bringing us up to the centenary 100th year of Fianna Fáil. Thanks very much for joining us here in the studio.
Thank you.
Thank you.